This video is the second part of my critique of Richard Carrier's methodology. In the first video, I focused on historical categories and comparative reasoning. In this video, I want to focus on what is actually my primary area of concern: probability theory. Many responses to Carrier, both from defenders and critics, fail not because they misunderstand ancient history, but because they lack a working grasp of probabilistic reasoning. As a result, much of the public debate around Carrier's work misses the methodological fault line entirely. My purpose here is to address that gap directly. Bayesian probability is a formal framework for updating the plausibility of a hypothesis in light of new evidence. Unlike frequentist probability, which interprets probability as a long-run relative frequency over repeated trials, Bayesian probability treats probability as a rational degree of credence relative to a specified body of background information. A Bayesian inference minimally requires four components. 1. A prior probability, representing an initial degree of belief grounded in an explicitly defined reference class or background model. 2. Likelihood functions, which specify the probability of observing the evidence conditional on each competing hypothesis. 3. The evidence itself, formally represented as the data upon which the model is conditioned. And 4. A posterior probability, obtained by updating the prior through Bayes' theorem. Importantly, it is not the evidence in isolation that performs the inferential work, but the likelihood ratio, the relative probability of the evidence under one hypothesis versus another, which determines the degree to which the evidence discriminates between competing explanations. For Bayesian inference to be epistemically meaningful, each of these components must be constrained by defensible assumptions and, where possible, empirical grounding. While Bayesian probability does not require all inputs to be known with precision, it does require that priors and likelihoods be justified rather than arbitrarily assigned. When priors are unconstrained, likelihoods are weakly specified, or reference classes are poorly defined, the resulting posterior does not represent genuine probabilistic inference, but rather intuition expressed in mathematical form. This point is central. Bayesian reasoning is not validated by the mere use of equations or formal notation, but by the epistemic legitimacy of the inputs. Without disciplined justification at each stage of the model, Bayes' theorem functions as a computational amplifier of prior assumptions rather than as a tool for evidence-driven inference. Carrier is correct about one thing: priors matter. Where the methodology becomes unstable is in how those priors are constructed. If we are evaluating the historicity of Jesus, the most historically grounded reference class would be something like Second Temple apocalyptic prophets, or teachers a class for which historicity is overwhelmingly attested. That reference class yields a high prior probability because it corresponds to a well-documented social phenomenon. Carrier instead assigns Jesus to a different reference class: mythical or semi-mythical hero figures, operationalized through the rank-Raglan scale. Once that classification is accepted, the prior probability drops sharply. The issue is not merely which category one prefers. The issue is whether the category allows for quantification independent of the conclusion. For Bayesian reasoning to be methodologically legitimate, prior probabilities must be anchored in empirical data or, at minimum, in constrained and defensible approximations. A prior does not need to be exact, but it must be disciplined, that is, bounded by independently verifiable information and explicit assumptions. In applied domains such as economics, epidemiology, or organizational science, this requirement is typically straightforward to satisfy. Consider a concrete example. If we wish to estimate the probability that a recession will negatively affect employee turnover in a specific role over the next year, we do not begin with intuition. We begin with a quantified baseline, the historical turnover rate for that position. If position-specific data are unavailable, we approximate using industry averages or firm-wide rates, while explicitly acknowledging the loss of precision. The resulting prior may be imperfect, but it remains constrained by observable reality and is therefore open to correction. This constraint is essential. A prior that is not tethered to data or to a clearly delimited approximation is not a probabilistic estimate at all. It is merely a numerical expression of subjective judgment. For the purposes of the present argument, I will grant carriers 1/3 prior without contest. The adequacy of that reference class and the legitimacy of that numerical estimate will be addressed later. What matters here is not whether the 1/3 figure is correct, but that a specific prior has been asserted and carried forward into the Bayesian framework. Even if we accept carrier's starting point, the Bayesian model still fails because there is no non-arbitrary way to compute the posterior probability. To see why, we will return to the turnover example. Suppose a position has an 8% annual turnover rate. Empirical research shows that roughly 9% of turnover is driven by opportunity-seeking behavior, while the remaining 91% arises from factors largely insensitive to macroeconomic conditions. During the Great Recession, new job opportunities declined by approximately 45%. It is therefore reasonable to update only the opportunity-driven component of turnover, yielding a revised posterior of roughly 7.7%. The critical point is structural. Evidence updates only the causal pathways it plausibly affects. Carrier does not do this. Carrier acknowledges that passages such as Galatians 1:19 constitute prima facie evidence in favor of historicity. He does not deny the existence of the evidence. Rather, he discounts its evidential force by arguing that the passage can be coherently reinterpreted within a revelatory or celestial framework. For the sake of argument, let us grant that reinterpretation. Even under this concession, Bayesian reasoning still requires the specification of a likelihood ratio, namely, an estimate of how much more probable this evidence would be if Jesus existed as a historical person than if he did not. This step is not optional. Without it, there is no Bayesian update, only a restatement of the prior. In applied Bayesian models, such likelihoods can often be approximated because the relevant mechanisms are empirically observable. In this case, however, no such mechanism exists. There is no frequency data for how often first-century religious movements generate kinship language under purely celestial beliefs, nor any independent metric for how often such language arises from historical relationships. As a result, any numerical likelihood assignment must be supplied entirely by interpretive judgment. Carrier's model, therefore, does not estimate the likelihood. It stipulates it. There is no frequency data. There is no causal decomposition. There is no independent calibration. Instead, numerical values are assigned based on interpretive judgment alone. The result is not a Bayesian update, but an unconstrained assignment of subjective weights. The posterior probability is therefore not derived from the model. It is embedded within it. At that point, the equations no longer discipline the reasoning. They merely disguise speculation as calculation. Bayesian methods are powerful when used correctly. Carrier's model fails, not because Bayesian reasoning is inappropriate for history, but because his implementation lacks the constraints required to make Bayesian reasoning meaningful. When priors are constructed from unstable categories and likelihoods are assigned without a defensible metric, the posterior probability ceases to be an inference. It becomes a restatement of the author's initial intuitions in numerical form. That is not a probabilistic scholarship. It is speculative historiography with equations attached. In the next video, I will return to the earlier assumption we temporarily granted, namely, whether the 1/3 prior probability itself can be justified. If you want to continue this discussion, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment.